Well, thank you. I've been to Alabama many times, but this is my first time to Mobile. And they trained me how to pronounce your city's name. And they also tried to get me ready for the language barrier, but you know, it's really not a big problem. I'm surprised. Nothing like going to Mississippi. So that's another story. But out at our book table, you'll actually see this little card that you're welcome to take with you. It's a quick summary of what we have found to be the best scientific evidences for the Christian faith. So that's a gift you can take with you. I'd like you to think about someone you could give that to. And there's also a little thing attached to it that you can fill out with contact information. And if you do that, we'll give you a free DVD. This is basically where I get interviewed and then field questions from skeptics. So that's a free gift just for coming tonight. The title, Genesis and Science Are the Enemies or Allies? And probably with the introduction, you already have an idea where I lean on this. After all, that was a foundation of reasons to believe. But I'm going to start with a question. How many of you have ever heard of Willie Sutton? I expect those of you that are about my age would have probably have heard of this gentleman. He ranks as the 20th century's most famous bank robber. An interesting bank robber, he said, you know, if you're going to rob a bank, you have to have a gun. There's no way you're going to get money from a bank unless you've got a gun. But he refused to load his guns. He says, I don't want anybody to get hurt. And so, but he wound up getting over $2 million from banks in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, up into the 50s. Spent a lot of his life in prison, but the last 10 years of his life he spent as a consultant for banks on how to stop people like himself. But when he was in that role, people asked him, well, why did you rob banks? After all, it's not easy robbing a bank. He says, that's where the money is. And you've probably heard about it. It's called Sutton's Law. It's actually become a psychological term. And so that's where the money is. Well, I could see not too many of you have heard of Willie Sutton. But how many of you have heard of this gentleman, Michael Shermer? Okay, he's the executive director of the Skeptic Society. Quite a few have heard of him. And he and I have publicly debated many times, never on the subject of Genesis. It's always been on a different subject. But what I've noticed in my many debates with Michael, it doesn't matter what the debate topic is. When he gets his chance to speak, he zooms in right on Genesis 1. Always spends his focus on Genesis 1. And I asked him, I says, you know, Michael, you know, we pick these different topics. Why do you always go straight to Genesis 1? And his answer is, well, kind of like Willie Sutton, that's where the money is. He's convinced that that's the easiest place to go to knock down the faith of Bible-believing Christians. He and virtually every professional atheist that I've debated zooms in on Genesis chapter 1. They see it as the best tool to destroy people's faith in the Bible as the Word of God. In fact, these atheists and skeptics have been so effective in using Genesis 1 as a weapon against the Christian faith, they've intimidated much of the Christian community. I mean, I'm not just an astrophysicist, I'm also a pastor. I've been a pastor of a church in between Caltech and JPL. It's an interesting church. We're between Caltech and JPL, and we're between Fuller Seminary and the headquarters of the Skeptic Society. So you can imagine the kind of people we get coming on a Sunday. It's always a debate. But as I speak to pastors, the majority of pastors that I have an opportunity to speak before basically are committed to stay away from the first 11 chapters of Genesis. They just see it as a minefield. We're not going there. Now, I also get to speak on a lot of seminary campuses, and many theologians still teach on Genesis. But this is what they do with Genesis 1. This is a quote. Genesis 1 ought not to be taken as a literal historical account of all material reality. Now, for 19 centuries, the church understood Genesis 1 as a literal historical account of natural history. But what has happened, particularly in the last 10 to 20 years, is a move away from that on the leading seminary campuses. And it's even gone so far where I'm actually hearing leading theologians saying, the word create doesn't mean create. The word make does not mean make. And there is no history in Genesis 1. There's no history in any of the early chapters of Genesis. Now, and it's all because of this atheist challenge. Now, I get to speak and write quite a bit on Genesis. My latest book, Navigating Genesis, takes you through the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And people ask me, why do you speak and write so frequently on this? Well, my answer is the same as for Willie Sutton and for Michael Shermer. That's where the money is. I found that's the best place to persuade people that the Bible is the inspired, inerrant Word of God. And so I'm going to take you through Genesis 1 this evening and basically show you why it is these atheists and skeptics think that this is the Achilles heel of the Christian faith and how we can transform it. Fundamentally, my goal tonight, in the next 30 minutes, is to transform Genesis 1 from Christianity's Achilles heel into one of the strongest reasons to believe that the Bible is the inspired, authoritative, inerrant Word of God. And how we're going to do this is through the scientific method. Now, I was born, raised, and educated in Canada. And the 12 years of public school education, I got taught the scientific method every year. We got it in grade 1. We got it in grade 2. We got it every single year. But none of my public school teachers ever told us where the scientific method came from. I didn't pick up a Bible to read it. By the way, my story is I really didn't get to know a Christian till I was 27. That's what happened when I got to the Caltech campus. Many of the world's most famous astronomers are Bible-believing Christians. That's where I got to know them for the first time. But I picked up a Bible at age 17. It was a Gideon Bible I picked up. And right away, I saw the scientific method right there in the first page of the Bible. In fact, every creation text you read in the Bible, it jumps out of the page. When I was 27, I discovered where the scientific method came from. Several authors have written how it was the Reformation that basically allowed people to read the Bible for themselves. And those with a scientific bent read the Bible and saw this biblical testing method. And that's the reason why the scientific revolution exploded out of Reformation Europe. They took this testing method out of the Bible and began to apply it to the research. I'm going to show you where this is in Genesis chapter 1. And we're going to apply it. And by applying this biblical testing method, we're going to transform Genesis 1 from being Christianity's greatest embarrassment into being one of our most potent tools to show that the Bible is indeed the Word of God. All right. Now, I'm going to go through this quite quickly. But as you see in the screen, we have quite a few resources here. And so I'm going to go through it fast, but I will mention resources where you can take your time and absorb this material in a little more depth and look for people you can actually give this away to. So with that, let me begin. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I found no matter where I travel in the world, everybody knows this verse. They may not know anything else in the Bible, but they know that one. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And when I debated Michael Shermer, he'd always go right to this passage and say, the Bible gets it wrong from the very first sentence. We know in science that the universe was formed before the earth. The Bible says they're formed at the same time. Now, I struggled with that when I first opened up the Bible. I said, what is this heavens and earth? And it says, I kept reading through the Old Testament, so I got to find the word universe. It's got to be in here somewhere. You won't find the word universe in the Old Testament. It's in the New Testament. In Greek, there's a word for the universe. In biblical Hebrew, there is no word in the language for the universe. Instead, they have this phrase, the shamayana res, with a definite article. Wherever you see heavens and earth with a definite articles, it always refers to the entirety of physical reality. Shows up 9 times in the Old Testament. Not to be confused with heaven and earth. That is a distinct meaning. The heavens and the earth means the entirety of physical reality, including not just all matter and energy, but even the space-time dimensions on which matter and energy are distributed. And the word create, it's bara in the Hebrew, which means to bring into existence something brand new that never existed before. Now, if you go to the New Testament, in Hebrews 11, it says the universe that we can detect did not come from that which we can detect. We can detect matter, energy, space, and time. And there's actually passages in the Bible that explicitly speak about what God was doing before he created time. Basically, it tells us that he was putting into effect the grace and hope that we share in the Christian faith. That was put into effect before time even existed. Now, part of my story is I began studying astronomy seriously when I was 7 years of age. Kind of scared my parents, but that's the way it was. And what I recognize is that what you see in the other religions of the world is that God creates within space and time that eternally exists. But when I picked up the Bible, I saw a different story, that space and time don't exist until God creates the universe. Now today, we have space-time theorems that prove that Genesis 1:1 got it right, that the universe indeed has a beginning that includes the creation of space and time. And this is what one of the authors of the very latest space-time, by the way, if you're interested, I got the space-time theorems right here that you can check out afterwards while you're enjoying coffee. Those of you who like tensor calculus, you're going to really love this stuff. But here's what one of the authors, Alexander Vlinkin, said about the latest space-time theorem. He said, quote, "With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." And on February 11th, that proof got even stronger. You know what happened on February 11th? They discovered gravity waves for the first time. Also discovered medium-sized black holes for the first time. Well, the basis of these space-time theorems is that general relativity is a correct theory. If general relativity is true, then indeed there's a beginning of space and time. And the very last prediction of general relativity that had not yet been demonstrated was that gravity waves are being emitted by black holes merging with one another. So that got shored up just this past February 11th. And by the way, my friends who are working on that, they think they've got a second black hole merger in the data. So that may be announced within the next few weeks. We'll see. So the proof got even stronger. In fact, today, general relativity ranks as the most exhaustively tested and best proven principle in all of physics, which is why Alexander Vlinkin says there is no escape. We have to face up to the fact that there is this beginning. And what's the problem that he's referring to? Proof of a space-time theorem, or a beginning, implies that there must be a causal agent beyond space and time who creates our universe of matter, energy, space, and time. That is the dictionary definition of the God of the Bible. Or to put it another way, a miracle-working God must exist. Now, you get all that from the first sentence of the Bible. So without even looking at the rest of Genesis 1, that is something we can all hang our hat on. Thanks to what's happened in physics and astronomy, we now know the rest of the holy books got it wrong. The Bible got it right. There is this beginning of space and time and a causal agent beyond space and time that created everything. Now, if you want more details on this, you can check out this book, Why the Universe is the Way It Is. There I explain to you in layman's language exactly what's behind these space-time theorems, what it implies, and how it's changed the whole course of debate on the existence of God. By the way, when you read the latest books by atheist physicists and astronomers, they're conceding this point. The debate has really shifted as to whether or not God is a personal being rather than opposed to whether there is a God. Although, if you read their literature, they will not call him God. It's the great causal agent beyond space and time that creates everything. But I think God is a shorter term for that. Okay. What I now want to do is apply the biblical testing method to take you through the rest of Genesis 1, because that's where the real controversies exist today. And here's an outline of what I'm going to share with you. We're going to look at the point of view for the 6 creation days. We're going to look at what these days are all about and whether or not we can actually establish from the text with a straightforward interpretation that everything is scientifically accurate in what is described and in the correct chronological order. Now, the reason why Michael Shermer and these professional atheists that we debate are convinced that Genesis 1 teaches scientific nonsense, they read Genesis 1:1, where it talks about the universe, and they presume that that point of view is held throughout the rest of the text. But it's not. Genesis 1:2 changes the point of view from the universe to the surface of the waters. The Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. The point of view, we're to understand the account of the 6 days from an observer's perspective below the clouds, not above the clouds. And you're going to see that makes all the difference. And it was Galileo who said the biggest mistake you can make in Bible interpretation is to get the wrong point of view. So notice the text here is explicit in changing the point of view from the universe to the surface of the waters. I've got a little diagram here for you. Surface of the waters, this is a time when the earth was a water world. There were no continents yet, but we're going to be told the account of the 6 days from that perspective, on the surface of the waters below the cloud layer. If you remember nothing else from the talk you hear tonight, remember that the point of view for the 6 creation days is the surface of Earth's ocean. Critical point, most important point. Some of you here I know are capable of remembering 2 things. Okay, the second thing you want to remember is that the Hebrew word yom that's translated as day has 4 distinct literal definitions. Now, this is true of virtually every Hebrew noun. And by the way, I think you're aware there's a controversy as the Christian Bible talking about a young earth or an old earth. I've learned as I travel around the world, this is predominantly an English language controversy. And the difference is this: the biggest vocabulary language that has ever existed is English. There's about 4 million words in the English language. Although my colleague Fuzz Rana, our staff biochemist, tells me half of those words are biochemical terms. But that still leaves you with 2 million words. Biblical Hebrew ranks as one of the smallest vocabulary languages that's ever existed. If you don't count the names of people in cities and towns, you're only looking at 3,000 words. So virtually every Hebrew noun has multiple literal definitions. You'll see the word earth in Genesis 1. It's got 5 distinct literal definitions. One you're probably more familiar with is heaven. In Corinthians, Paul says he was taken up to the 3rd heaven. He was trying to distinguish which of the 3 literal definitions of heaven that he was referring to. The word day, yom, translated day, has 4 different literal definitions. It can mean part of the daylight hours, like from noon to 3 p.m., all of the daylight hours, sunrise to sunset, a 24-hour period, or it can mean a long but finite period of time. Now, I first picked up the Bible to read it at age 17, looked at Genesis 1, and right away I saw 3 definitions for that word day. Creation day 1 is talking about days and nights, and I said that's the daylight hours. Creation day 4, seasons, days, and years. That's 24 hours. Genesis 2:4 uses the word day to refer to the entire creation history. There's your long period of time. But you can pick up any lexicon and it'll show you these 4 distinct literal definitions. The other thing that's important to realize is that in English, we have over a dozen words for a long period of time. Epoch, age, eon, those are some examples. In biblical Hebrew, the only word you got is this word yom. Now, in modern Hebrew, they got 2 words, but in biblical Hebrew, this is the only word that can use for a long but finite period of time. Now, I've written an entire book on this subject that we just came up with a brand new edition, a matter of days, basically making the point, and this is kind of a hallmark of Reasons to Believe, we're integrationists. We're committed to integrate all the scientific disciplines to see what it says about God and truth. We're also committed to integrate all 66 books of the Bible. And so our message is it's not enough to take the Bible literally, we have to take it literally and consistently. It won't do to have one book of the Bible contradict another book of the Bible. And so what I point out in a matter of days, if you want to read all 66 books, both literally and consistently, These days must be 6 consecutive long periods of time. And again, that's one of the great ways of settling these controversies, both in theology and in science, integrate across the whole database. I mean, you're probably aware there's a big controversy over the flood. It's not just Genesis that talks about the flood. Psalms does, Proverbs does, Job does, 2 Peter does. And so you want to integrate all the texts. All right. Genesis 1:2 does something else. So by the way, let me give you a quick example. Because what I do in a matter of days is give you 20 biblical reasons why these days must be 6 consecutive long periods of time. The thing I notice at age 17 is there's an evening and a morning that brackets each of the 6 creation days. I thought I'd find one for the 7th day. It's not there. There is no evening and morning for the 7th day. And when I thought about these evenings and mornings, I said at a minimum, it means that the day had a start point and the day had an end point. And so the first 6 days are finished. The 7th day is not yet finished. And if you go on into the rest of the Bible, Psalm 95, John 5, and Hebrews 4 all tell us we're still in the 7th day. And let me give you a little bit of background, because this is a huge light bulb going off for me at age 17. I was 7 years of age, reading about 5 books in physics and astronomy a week, and I kept this up all the way through my 10th year. My parents got worried about me. They thought I was over-specializing. I probably was. And so they wanted me to be looking at the other sciences as well. And my family was poor, but they sacrificed to buy me this really thick book on evolutionary biology. I was the only one in the family that read it. But I remember coming back to my parents and says, I've read the book, but the numbers don't add up. We have all this speciation before humanity and virtually none afterwards. Now, from the age of 10 onwards, that enigma plagued me, and I could see no resolution to it until I picked up Genesis 1. No evening and morning for the 7th day. What does God do in the 7th day? He stops creating. It says, finally, an answer to the fossil record enigma. We see it before humanity because those are the 6 days when God creates. We don't see it today because we're in the day of rest. And if you read to the end of the Bible, there comes a time when God will create again. The 7th day will end, but we're still in the 7th day. And explains why biology today looks so different from biology in the past. Because God was creating in the past. He's not creating today. Genesis 1:2 is not done. Step 1 of the scientific method. Don't interpret until you first establish the frame of reference or the point of view. Step 2, don't interpret until you establish the starting conditions or the initial conditions. The rest of Genesis 1:2 gives you that very thing. Lays out 4 initial conditions. Before God creates, it's dark on the surface of the waters. The water covers the whole surface of the earth, and the earth is formless and void. It's empty of life and unfit for life. Now, Genesis 1 is not the only text that takes you through the 6 days of creation. Psalm 104 takes you through the 6 days. Job 37, 38, and 39 take you through the 6 days, as well as Proverbs chapter 8. In fact, there are multiple texts in the Bible. But what you'll see in Job is this statement relative to what's going on before creation day 1. God speaks and he says, I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness. It referring to the waters that cover the surface of the earth. So notice in the book of Job, it's explicit about why it's dark. It's dark because of the clouds. It's not dark because of the lack of light. Light pervades the universe. When God created the universe, you got matter, energy, space, and time. So the universe was filled with light, but it was dark on the surface of the waters because the clouds would not let light pass through. And as an astronomer, I can tell you that was indeed the initial condition of planet Earth. The primordial Earth had an atmosphere more than 100 times thicker than it has today, which means our atmosphere would have been even more impervious to light than the atmosphere of Venus. Venus's atmosphere is so thick that the only light that gets through is deep red and infrared. All the other colors are blocked out. Earth's atmosphere, when it was formed, was 3 times thicker. It wouldn't even let the red light through. It was dark on the surface of the waters. Then we get to creation day 1. What does the text say? Let there be light. It uses the verb haya, let there be. It does not use the word create or make. God made the light in the beginning, but it was dark on the surface of the waters. But in creation day 1, let there be light. This is when God allows light to come through the atmosphere and reach the surface of the waters. And this is when photosynthesis can begin. This is where we, at Reasons to Believe, put the origin of life, at the beginning of creation day 1. Let there be light. And so our atmosphere got transformed from being very thick to being as thin as it is today, where light could come through. Creation day 2 is very brief. It says, let there be water above and water below. It's basically all it says. Now, one reason why Job could be so succinct in Genesis chapter 1 is because of how detailed the account of the science of the 6 days is laid out in Job 37, 38, and 39. And I wrote a book, Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job. I think we have it here, basically making the point that there's textual details that tell us that the content of the book of Job predates that of Genesis by about 500 or 600 years. And therefore, the people that Moses was speaking to already had the content of the book of Job. He didn't have to repeat what Job talked about. And so he could be very brief about creation day 2. If you go to Job 37, the entire chapter 37 of Job and the first half of Job 38 basically expand on creation day 2. And if you read that chapter and a half, it speaks in great detail about a God miraculously establishing a complex water cycle so that human beings could exist on the face of the earth. It actually lists 16 different types of precipitation, but the 6 main ones are rain, mist, and dew, referring to the liquid precipitation, and then snow, frost, and hail, referring to the frozen precipitation. And what you see in Job is how we need all these different types of precipitation in the water cycle so that we can have human beings thriving over the whole surface of the earth. Now, I don't have time tonight to explain to you the miraculous nature of creation day 1 and creation day 2. But we do have this DVD out there at the table, Journey Toward Creation. And there's video clips there where I describe for you the miraculous nature of what happened on creation day 1 and creation day 2. And we're actually bringing out a book that will give it to you in much more detail coming out this September. But it explains why, of all the Earth-like planets we're finding, Earth is the only one that's not bone dry or drowning in water. We have exactly the right amount of water and exactly the right atmosphere. And we see it nowhere else. Earth is alone. By the way, we're finding planets the same mass as the Earth, same approximate distance from their star. They're coming in at 10 to 50% water. Ours is 0.03% water. Or they're coming in with no water at all. Bone dry with no atmosphere, or they got a heavy atmosphere and a very deep ocean. Both ways, there's no possibility for advanced life. Creation day 3, it speaks about the land masses forming. This is when God transforms the earth from a water world where we now have oceans and continents coexisting. And by the way, many books of the Bible speak about creation day 3. It's also in Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. You'll see it in Peter as well as here in Genesis 1. Let dry ground appear. Now, I had the good fortune of being educated in Canada by 2 of the 3 physicists that launched plate tectonics as a scientific discipline. Today, that discipline is so well matured that we actually can calculate specifically the growth history of the continental land masses, and indeed demonstrates that the Bible got it right, that planet Earth starts off as a water world, and then we get these small volcanic islands, and then plate tectonics kicks in and the continents begin to build up. What I want you to notice from this graph is the time when the continents are being pushed up most aggressively. It happens when the Earth is a little bit less than half of its current age. Where does Genesis 1 put it? The beginning of creation, day 3. So here you got 6 days of creation. What we notice here is that the Bible puts it exactly at the same time that our plate tectonics discipline of geophysics places it. Now, I've mentioned to you before that I've debated Michael Shermer several times, never on the topic of Genesis, but he always goes straight to that. The one point he's brought up every time I've debated him, he says, we know Genesis got it wrong, because Genesis tells us that the land plants predate the animals in the oceans, and the fossil record is exactly the opposite. We have the animals in the ocean showing up before evidence for plants on the continents. Now, when I first debated him, I made the point, well, of course, Michael, we're talking considerable passage of time. Animals have skeletons and shells, so they're going to be preserved. Plants do not. They're going to decay and leave nothing behind. So it's not surprising we don't have this fossil evidence. However, we have it today. The first inkling took place in 2009 when a paper was published in Nature making the point, we don't have the fossils, but we have the isotope signatures that tell us that plants were just as abundant on the continents for 200 million years before the first appearance of animals as for the 200 million years thereafter. Then a paper got published late in 2011 in the same journal where they said, we've now found the fossils. Well, it's a bit of an exaggeration. They didn't find complete fossils, they found fossil parts. The biggest part was 1 millimeter across, but nevertheless demonstrated that plants were just as abundant on the continental land masses for 600 million years before the first appearance of animals in the ocean. And so Genesis 1 got it right. This is a dramatic example of how we see the first chapter of the Bible predicting a future scientific discovery 3,500 years ahead of its time. And we happen to be living in that period where we see this vindication. Creation day 4, the text says, let there be the great lights. And also explains why. Let there be the great lights so that they may serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years. And when I noted at age 17, in looking at Genesis 1, all the life that God creates before the 4th day doesn't need to know where the sun, moon, and stars are in the sky. But all the life that God creates after day 4 is sufficiently complex, at least on occasion, they need to know the position of the sun, moon, and stars. So in creation day 4, God transformed the atmosphere from translucent to transparent. Now, I grew up in coastal British Columbia, so I was quite familiar with translucent skies. That's where it's permanently overcast. You can see light, but you can't see any of the sun, moon, and stars. Creation day 4 is when the planet went from permanently overcast to where now the clouds break. And notice what the text says. Let there be the great lights so they may serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years, so that birds and mammals, for example, will know when to migrate, when to reproduce, when to put on body fat so they can get ready for a hibernation. If you're a bacterium, you don't need any of that information. But if you're one of the animals that God describes on creation day 4, or creation day 5 and 6, that's absolutely essential. Today, we know what physics and chemistry brought about this transformation. Basically, we call the great oxygenation events, where the planet goes from having very little oxygen in its atmosphere. By the way, our atmosphere always had a tiny amount of oxygen. But what happened is all the photosynthetic life that God created pumped huge amounts of oxygen in the atmosphere, but the minerals of Earth's crust and the mantle basically sopped up all that oxygen. And so these, what we call mineral oxygen sinks, had to be filled before oxygen could begin to build up in the atmosphere. And so you got what's called the great oxygenation event. That's the one in the middle where it bumps up to a couple of percent, but then it drops right back down because another sink is being filled. But what happened about 575 million years ago, the oxygen went from a 1% level up to 8%. And that's what caused the atmosphere for the first time to become transparent, at least on occasion. But something else happened. When it hit 8%, you immediately have the Avalon animals. Now, these are animals that don't have a digestive tract. They don't have a skeleton, but some of them are 2 meters across. So they're big animal life forms, but they're basically like sponges and jellyfish. They show up the moment the oxygen allows them to exist. You can't have those kinds of creatures without 8% oxygen. But a profound challenge to the evolutionary paradigm, there is no time delay between the jump from 1% to 8% and the appearance of these animals. I mean, you can see the challenge. You go from bacteria to creatures that are 2 meters across instantly. Then these creatures are driven to extinction. And so you have a planet with no animals anymore. But now the oxygen goes from 8% to 10%. Once it hits 10%, you've now got enough oxygen that you can have animals with a digestive tract, with organs like ears and eyes, and with a skeletal frame. And the moment it hits 10%, you get this burst of animal life. And that's creation day 5. Creation day 5 says, let the seas swarm with these small sea creatures. And some of them weren't that small. But the seas now proliferate with all of these animal life forms. The Cambrian explosion. The first one was the Avalon explosion 575 million years ago. And then 543, you get the Cambrian explosion. And it really is an explosion because we see 87% of all mathematically conceivable skeletal body plans showing up all at once. Now today we have less than 50%, but at the Cambrian explosion you have this massive eruption of every conceivable body plan. And as far as the eyes go, for example, every eye design we see in the planet today was present at the Cambrian explosion, right there at the beginning. And so you go from, as soon as it hits that 10% oxygen, immediately all these creatures appear. This is recognized in the scientific literature as the most profound challenge to a materialistic explanation for the history of life. Here's a quote from Richard Dawkins. He writes in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, the Cambrian strata of rocks, vintage about 600 million years, are the oldest ones in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups. And we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution the first time they appear. It is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Gregory Ray wrote this in The American Zoologist. The Cambrian explosion of body plans is perhaps the single most striking feature of the Metazoan fossil record. Metazoan means big creatures. Of the Metazoan fossil record. The rapidity with which phyla and classes appeared during the early Paleozoic, coupled with much lower rates of, I can't read this, much lower rates, poses an outstanding problem for macroevolution. Then Kevin Peterson wrote a review just a few years ago on the Cambrian explosion. He says, elucidating the materialistic basis, that is, the non-theistic basis for the Cambrian explosion, has become more elusive, not less, the more we know about the event itself. And when we founded Reasons to Believe 30 years ago, we said we're going to deal with this challenge that we get from the scientific community. And that challenge is this, is that Christianity and creation has no place in the scientific arena because it's not testable, it's not falsifiable, it's not predictive. And so 30 years ago, we founded Reasons to Believe and said, we're going to present the scientific community with a biblical, testable creation model. We're going to show them how it can be tested, how it can be falsified, and we're going to be aggressive at making predictions about future scientific discoveries. You can ask me about some in the Q&A if you want. We have a whole bunch there on the table. And our whole point is, if we can offer a more comprehensive explanation of physical reality, where our predictions are coming true at a much more consistent rate than those of opposing models, then the scientific community needs to seriously consider the claims that the Bible makes on the life of every human being. That's how you engage the scientific community. It's not enough to knock down their model. You have to show them a superior model that can take its place, one that offers greater explanatory power and greater predictive success. And this is why we get invited to speak on university campuses in America and around the world. It's because they know that we're prepared to engage in the scientific method and the testing of ideas. But the Cambrian explosion is acknowledged as a profound challenge to a non-theistic interpretation. But the text is not done. Creation Day 5, we see the second use of the word bara to create something brand new that never existed before, a reference to the soulish animals. These are the creatures that are endowed with mind, will, and emotions. These are the creatures that will sacrifice to care for their young. And these are the creatures that reach out to human beings in their desire to relate to us. These are the creatures we can tame. And the text here uses two verbs. It says God made them and he created them, making the point there's something about these animals that's not brand new. Physical bodies existed before, but what is brand new is they're not just physical, they're also soulish. And they've been endowed with a motivation and a capacity to relate to a higher species, namely us human beings. And so it's the birds and the sea mammals. Now, again, when I debated Michael Shermer, he says there's another place where Genesis gets it wrong. It places sea mammals before land mammals. But what he misses is this. When you go to Creation Day 6, it's not speaking about God creating the first land mammals. It skips ahead. If you want the rest of the details, read Job 38 and 39. It gives a lot more detail on God creating the animals. But here it jumps ahead to identify three separate categories of land mammals, those that are most critical for launching and sustaining human civilization. So it's ignoring the first mammals that God created and jumping ahead to the three that are most crucial for sustaining human civilization. Because after all, that's the epitome of Creation Day 6. God's going to create human beings. Now, the three it targets are the short-legged land mammals. These are the rodents. So what do we need rodents for? Well, our human body is well designed to live in a hot climate, but terribly designed to live in a cold climate. But God wanted us to become global. So he gave us these rodents so that we could harvest them and use them for clothing. The wonderful thing about these rodents is they're small-bodied and warm-blooded, and the way they keep warm, they grow luxuriant fur. They love being around us human beings. They don't mind being with thousands of their buddies at once, and you can easily raise these rodents and then turn them into clothing. In fact, when I was a child, there was a thriving furrier industry in Canada where many Canadians were having these farms of rodents where they were harvesting to make fur coats for rich Americans. And then we had two kinds of long-legged land mammals that are mentioned, those that are easy to tame, contrasted with those that are difficult to tame. And again, this is very brief, but you got a chapter and a half in the book of Job that goes into this in detail. What you see in Job is that God created these long-legged beasts of the field, some to serve, others to please. And those that are easy to tame is a reference to the herbivores. They're easy to tame, and they make excellent agricultural animals. And that was the launch of human agricultural industry. And you see this described in detail in the book of Job. And then he gave us long-legged land mammals that are not very good for agricultural industry, but make excellent personal companions, a reference to the carnivores. They're difficult to tame, but once tamed, they make excellent human companions. Yet I showed a lion there on purpose, because when I was at Caltech, there was an undergraduate student who brought his pet lion to class every day. And this lion has loved people. And loved going to lectures because it could sit right by the professor's feet and all the students would be staring at the lion. And then, of course, the lion would get all kinds of attention before class and after class, and especially loved the lunchtime when all the little toddlers would be let out. And that lion, very tame lion, very gentle lion. By the way, it's illegal now to have a pet lion, mainly because people don't know how to raise a lion properly, and if you don't, you can get into trouble. But hey, if you want someone to protect your personal body, I can't think of a better pet to have than a lion. Anyway, I described this in some detail in this book, Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, and what we see is that Genesis 1 culminates with God creating human beings. And here again it uses two verbs. It said God made us and he created us. There's something about us that's not brand new. Our physical bodies are not brand new. In fact, the mind, will, and emotions that we share with the birds and mammals is not brand new. What is brand new is that we're spiritual. And it tells us in the book of Job, look to the birds, they'll instruct you. Look to the beasts of the field, they will teach you. And if you go on in the book of Job, it's making the point they'll teach you about yourself and about God and how you can come to God. And one of the lessons we see here is that God designed the birds and mammals to serve and please us and to form relationship with us, a higher species. Likewise, he designed us human beings to serve and please a higher being and to relate to that higher being. So this is where we're distinct from the animals. And there's many articles that have been written in the scientific literature making the point that we humans indeed are exceptional with respect to the animals. On the other hand, I want to emphasize the birds and mammals and the few of the higher reptilian species are exceptional with respect to all other non-soulish life. Anyway, if you want to read up on human origins, we just brought out a new edition of Who is Adam? It was released just a few months ago, and we take you through the Bible and the latest scientific evidence, documenting that indeed Genesis got it right when he said all of humanity is descended from one man and one woman that God specially created just thousands of years ago in one location. Now, when I first picked up the Bible, I started with the first page of the Bible. Because I was a young science student, it took me about 4 hours to get to the end of Genesis chapter 1, because I was checking everything out. But here is my conclusion at the end of that 4-hour period. Once we appreciate that the frame of reference for the 6 creation days is the surface of the waters, and these days are 6 consecutive, non-overlapping periods of time, this is a score you get when you compare the book of the Bible with the book of nature. And it's a Belgic confession that says that God gave us 2 books, the book of nature and the book of Scripture. And it's Job and Psalms that tell us the more we study nature, the more evidence we'll see for the handiwork of God. And so what I saw here was a perfect score. Now, I'd also looked at about 100 other creation stories in the different religions and cultures of the world. The best I found outside of the Bible was the Enuma Elish, which got 2 out of 14 right. The rest of them got a score of 0. The Bible is the only one I looked at that got a perfect score. And also struck me as a dramatic example of an author writing 3,500 years ago and correctly predicting both the description of events and the order of events of creation. And that was my first clue that this book that we call the Bible is not just written by human beings. It had to be inspired by the one that actually did the deed. And that was one of the major factors that motivated me to sign my name in the back of this Gideon Bible that was given to me in a Canadian public school at age 11. At age 19, I signed my name in the back of this Bible, committing my life to Jesus Christ. But Genesis 1 was a crucial factor in my making that commitment. And I remember running into my wife, Kathy, when I arrived at Caltech. I met her at a Bible study. And I showed up at the Bible study, and she came over and talked to me and said, "You're an astronomer, and you're obviously a serious Bible-believing Christian. What do you do at Genesis 1? So I shared that with her, and she said, that was the reason why my brother walked away from the Christian faith. He couldn't reconcile Genesis 1 with what he was learning in his science classes. And so it also set my wife free to share her faith. He says, now I'm no longer afraid to talk to people about the Christian faith. And I found that if you can actually give people some confidence that they can defend the Bible against any question they're going to get from a non-Christian, they'll begin to actively share their faith. And by the way, when I signed my name in the back of this Gideon Bible, I recognize that becoming a Christian is committing yourself to go public with your faith in Jesus Christ. That we're all called to share our faith. As it says in 1 Peter, always be ready to give the reasons for the hope within you with gentleness, respect, and a clear conscience. And what I want to close with is this. If you'll commit yourself to develop sound reasons for your biblical faith, and are prepared to share that with gentleness and respect, you will see God supernaturally bringing people across your path. And when I come home from a flight where I've been speaking, I sit down with our office staff and I tell them stories of strangers I've met, either in a store where I was picking up food or in the airport, or those long lines you go through in the airport. Things happen. And our staff philosopher, Ken Samples, was skeptical and saying, "Hugh, I can't believe this happens virtually every time you go on a trip." And so he came with me once, and we were waiting in the airport for our flight, and my wife calls, and she had some questions about a booklet that we were editing. And I mentioned a couple of places, just a couple of words about Genesis 1. A gentleman seated 15 to 20 feet away, after I got off the phone, got up and came over and said, "Were you talking about Genesis 1? And I said, "Yes." And he said, "It sounded like you actually think it's true." And I said, "Yes." He says, "I got some questions for you." Turned out he was a computer science professor at Stanford University. Anyway, we get on the plane. Ken and I are in the very back, and he's in the front. And once we turned the seatbelts off, he got out of his first-class seat, walked all the way to the back, and spent the rest of the flight talking to us about Genesis 1. We get off the plane, we go to baggage claim, the conversation continues. And Ken tells me, "I don't think that was an accident. This is a gentleman who's struggling with what to do with Genesis when he wasn't a believer. But what's intrigued him is meeting people who are highly educated that actually believed it was true in the Word of God, and it got him thinking for the first time." With that, I want to open the time up for questions. And by the way, I'll take any question. It doesn't have to have anything to do with Genesis. Anything you want to raise on science, faith, philosophy, Christianity, any challenge you want to raise up, I'm free to take that. We've got 2 microphones here.
Yeah, Dr. Ross, so let me explain that real quick because there's a little technical thing we have to do. First, I just wanted to give Dr. Ross a round of applause for that presentation. I think that was very wonderful. Thank you. So thank you very much. The way that we would like to do this is we'd like to spend the next 15 or so minutes taking Q&A from the audience. And as Dr. Ross alluded, there will be 2 of us. I'll be over here, and then we'll have another guy over there. If you have a question, just simply raise your hand, and then one of us will come to you, and we'll alternate back and forth from across the room. So do we have our first question? All right.
So you referenced the Cambrian explosion earlier and about how you have all these quotes of atheists saying that that's kind of like the biggest thing that they have to answer, but I've still read things where atheists scoff at the fact that Christians bring that up and they try to make fun of it, but then I never really see a whole lot of explanation of why. What kind of explanations do they give? What's like the most current explanation of how they explain the Cambrian explosion?
Well, they try to make the point that maybe it's not as explosive as what it looks. After all, we see Cambrian animals showing up 40 million years later. And so maybe the Cambrian event is actually stretched over 40 million years. Now, what's made that impossible to hold is that we have found a Cambrian explosion site in China that complements the one we found in British Columbia. And just about a year ago, they found another site in British Columbia where they found 7 new species that weren't discovered before. And so we have all these different Cambrian fossil sites with different dates that basically establish that the most advanced of the Cambrian explosion animals are present at the very base of the Cambrian explosion, including fish. We see fish, so we see vertebrates existing right at 543 million years. So we're not looking at a 40 million year passage of time. And what you notice within the biological and paleontological literature, they like to take advantage of the maximum range of the error bar. And so they used to say the Cambrian explosion event was 540 million years ago, plus or minus 40 million years. Well, instead of going with a 0, they go with a 40. But what has happened over the intervening 2 decades is those error bars have gotten smaller and smaller. And the latest combination of the Chinese site with the sites in British Columbia tell us that the Cambrian event, the window of time for these 87% of all mathematically conceivable body plans all showing up, takes place within a window less than 500,000 years wide. And so it happens with such rapidity. And notice, I tried to quote from you, the last quote I gave you was a rather recent review paper, basically making the point, we know a lot more about the Cambrian event than we did before, but it makes the non-theistic interpretation far more difficult to hold than what we had, say, 30, 40 years ago. And when I debate biologists in the Cambrian explosion, I typically find they're simply out of date with what the latest literature is saying about the Cambrian event. Now, I got a book coming out this in September where I actually include a key prediction of the Darwinian model, which is that the fossil evidence is going to match the molecular clock evidence, where you basically look at the DNA and try to determine the date when you'd expect, based on the Darwinian model, when you'd expect these events to take place. It's discordant with the fossil record data by 200 million years. And so there's now a recognition within the community of evolutionary biologists that molecular clocks are useless. However, if the Darwinian model is correct, the molecular clocks must work. They don't work. So that's the very latest challenge to the Darwinian paradigm. Now, you might wonder why so many evolutionary biologists hang on to it. Well, one of the scientists of Volunteers Force heads up one of the world's largest evolutionary biology labs, and her comment is, the Darwinian model never factors into our research. I mean, it's irrelevant to the research we're doing. We never even talk about this when we get together and do our research. However, for those that it is a factor, it's a recognition that, hey, we need to get a little more interdisciplinary. And I mentioned before, the heart of reasons to believe is integrating across the scientific disciplines. And what we're noticing is it's astrophysics that explains why the fossil record looks the way it does, rather than some Darwinian principle. Because the sun is getting progressively brighter and brighter, and its ultraviolet radiation and X-ray radiation and flaring is getting progressively less and less. And so it explains why the fossil record looks the way it does, and why you have 3 billion years of nothing but bacteria. And by the way, those first 3 billion years of bacteria, and what's interesting is in Psalm 104, the message is God packs the planet with as much life as possible, as diverse as possible, and for as long as possible, in order that humanity would be endowed with the richest possible biodeposits. So that's one thing. God wanted us to have 76 trillion, quadrillion plus tons of biodeposits. The other thing is he wanted an environment that was chemically safe for advanced life. And it's the bacteria that chemically transform the planet from being a toxic environment for advanced life to being a safe environment for advanced life. And so bringing in the geophysics and the astrophysics is actually bringing a lot of light into why the history of life looks the way it does. And here's the very latest. You can't get plate tectonics to work without life. So it explains why the origin of life is coincident with the date for the origin of tectonic activity. The two work synergistically together. Without the life, you can't sustain the tectonics. But if you don't sustain the tectonics, you can't sustain the life, because it's the tectonics that sets up the mechanism where you can compensate for the changing physics of the sun. But what it really tells you is nothing less than a mind that knows the future physics of the solar system is going to know which life to have on the planet at which time. Yes?
I heard various reasons why we have different races.
Yes?
And I mean, I've heard also, in the beginning of time, it said they went and they had sex, whatever, with other people. And where the various races come from, and I understand that in the beginning of time it said that, of course, Adam and Eve have children over a period of time, and because there was not incest problem, they married, or whatever, they didn't marry, whatever. They became one and had children. How did the races come about?
Okay, my colleague Fuzz Rana has a DVD you can get. We don't have it here, but you can get it off of our reasons.org website, which talks about the origin of the races. And he begins by making the point that we human beings make a big deal about skin color of humans, but we don't make a big deal about the skin color of dogs, cows, horses, or whatever. And we recognize that tiny microevolutionary events will generate color differentiation in the rest of the land mammals that share the planet with us. And so he makes the point, wouldn't we expect that to be the case for human beings as well? Now, what's different about human beings is that we've had culture in place to preserve color distinctions, which is typically not the case with other land mammals. And so you see color variation of land mammals virtually everywhere. We don't see it for humanity because there's been cultural practices in place that basically prevented people of different skin colors from intermarrying with one another. But what's interesting is that those cultural barriers are virtually disappearing today. And so there are geneticists that are saying it won't be long before we'll be just like the animals on the planet, where you're going to see different racial disparity literally all over the planet. As a matter of fact, that's causing some of my friends who do research in genetics alarm, because we've been taking advantage of racial purity to DNA trace the origin of humanity. And this is where we determine that human beings indeed came from one location, not multiple locations, and came within a time sequence that's compatible with the best calibration of the Genesis 5 and 11 genealogies. But what they're telling me is that we probably got 10, at most 20 years left before we can't do that research anymore. Because for that research to work, we have to do DNA analysis on populations where they don't intermarry with people of different ethnic background. And when they tell me we're now down to just 5 racial groups where we can do the DNA research: the Estonians, the Finns, the Armenians, the Jews, and one subclass of the Japanese. They're the only people groups left where there's enough cultural barrier in place to prevent marrying people of a different ethnic background where that research can be done. And even those nations, it's going to disappear in 10 or 20 years. So it makes the point, we're not the same as other life forms. We have culture that has put in place these racial distinctives that we don't see for other animal groups. But it's all microevolution that explains why we have the different skin colors we do. And by the way, where you see the greatest genetic diversity amongst human beings is in South Africa between the Bantu blacks and the Zulu blacks. They differ from one another genetically more than we differ from each one of them as Caucasians. And so, I mean, I've been to South Africa. You can see a slight difference between the Bantus and the Zulus. But that's actually where we have the greatest genetic diversity between two groups of human beings. So again, it's no big deal.
We'll take 2 more questions.
Okay.
I've got one over here. Dr. Ross on your right side.
Right side. All right. Sorry.
Yes, sir. I was just wondering.
I mean, I'm getting it from the speaker here. Sorry.
Why do you think so many, like a good bit of Christian scientists fall into theistic evolutionism, like William Lane Craig, Alistair McGrath, and Francis Collins? And I recall a quote by Francis Collins saying that he thinks evolution in the future will expel intelligent design. And he's a Christian biologist, I think. So
Yes.
I was just wondering why you think they fall into that in their field.
Well, I know Francis. I've had conversations with him. My colleague Fuzran has had even more. In fact, tomorrow I'll be going to Birmingham, where I'll be engaging the president of BioLogos, which is probably the leading group promoting that particular worldview. And where we differ from BioLogos is that they believe that, in fact, to be fair to them, they call themselves evolutionary creationists. They don't like to be called theistic evolutionists. They do believe in the miracles of the New Testament. They do not accept the miracles of creation in the Old Testament, except for the universe. They do agree with us that God supernaturally created the universe. They also agree with us that God supernaturally designed the universe and the earth so that humans could live here on planet Earth. So that's where we agree. But where we disagree is on the biology. They claim that common descent explains the whole history of life here on planet Earth. We're making the point that it's design, not common descent. We do agree microevolution happens, but for example, they see humanity as coming from a large population, whereas we say it's 2 individuals. And I remember talking to Francis Collins on this, and he says, Hugh, I'm a geneticist. You're an astrophysicist. And in genetics, this is like gravity we're as certain as you are about gravity that indeed humanity came from a population of 10,000 individuals. Well, I'm old enough to remember when the scientific literature was saying we came from a population of 1 million individuals. Then it became 100,000. Francis Collins came up with his book and said 10,000. When my colleague debated Dennis Venema, another member of the BioLogos team, he said 1,200. I've now seen some of them say 800. And I'm saying, let's plot a graph and see where it's going. But here's my biggest critique. I'm an astronomer. We don't accept anything as rock solid in astronomy unless our theory is giving the same answer as our observations. And our observations and theory are giving the same answers as our lab experiments. Until we see all three supporting the same answer, we're hesitant on saying this is really the truth of what's going on. What I see in genetics is they have a theoretical model. Now, there are experiments which we cite in our dialogues with BioLogos. Experiments that are done, for example, on sheep, where they took 2 sheep and they put it on an island that had no mammals on it at all in the South Indian Ocean, and they let these sheep reproduce. Now, they knew the DNA of the original female and male, and they measured the DNA 10 and 12 and 15 generations later. The DNA was far more diverse than what the theoretical models predicted, which tells me when the theoretical model says 10,000 individuals, that's an upper limit. It can't be higher than that, but it could be lower than that. And by the way, that experiment's been done on horses and orangutans, and always shows more genetic diversity being generated than what the models predict. Therefore, I'm quite comfortable with the position that all of humanity is descended from one man and one woman. By the way, BioLogos agrees with us that it's in the thousands of years, not the millions of years. Now, they'll say something like 200,000 years, plus or minus 200,000, which I think, yeah, I agree with that. But as I look at what the Bible tells me, it tells me that Adam and Eve were created during an ice age, because you got 4 rivers coming together. That can only happen during an ice age, the 4 named rivers. And also tells us that the flood waters took 7.5 months to recede. That again requires that we be in an ice age. And you can calibrate very crudely the Genesis 5 and 11 genealogies, which roughly puts Adam at about 70,000 plus or minus 40,000 years ago. Now, that's a lot less time than the millions of years you see from the atheistic evolutionists. It's less time than what BioLogos says, although in one respect with the big error bars, they're in the same ballpark as we are. But where we really differ is on this point. They say we're not going anywhere with our scientific creation model unless we have 95% or better support from the scientific community. Our response to that is that'll never happen, because the Bible tells us there will never be a majority that will turn their life to Jesus Christ. On the other hand, I'm very uncomfortable if all we got is, say, 1% support from the scientific community. Why? Because the Bible tells us there will be a large minority that will submit their life to Jesus Christ. And so I'm quite happy that we've got 40% support from the scientific community. To me, that's about right. We don't expect a majority. But that's what I've noticed with theistic evolutionists in general. They're wanting to have a model that's credible with virtually the entire scientific community. And that what's frustrated me is I tried to press them on the origin of life. I said, surely you're going to agree with us that just like the universe must be supernaturally explained, likewise the origin of life. Now, what's interesting, if you look at the community of physicists and astronomers, the vast majority agree with what I told you about Genesis 1:1. They also agree that there's overwhelming evidence that the universe has been designed for life. So there you got the 95% support. But when it comes to the origin of life, we know it happened in an instant of time, a geologic instant of time, and we can prove it happened without the benefit of prebiotic building block molecules. Now, you don't have to be a philosopher to realize if you have no building block molecules, you have no possible naturalistic explanation for the origin of life, which is why we thought surely the theistic evolutionists would agree with us on that. But they didn't. because the vast majority of origin of life researchers are still holding out for a naturalistic explanation. Well, I'll tell you what happened. The last Origin of Life research conference I attended, it was a 4-day conference, and the very last statement that was made at the conference was, during this conference, on Monday, we eliminated Earth as a possible site for the origin of life. On Tuesday, we eliminated Mars as a possible site for the origin of life, where that life somehow got transported to the Earth. And then we eliminated the rest of the solar system on the next day, and we eliminated all other planetary systems. And we eliminated the idea that dust or rocks could bring life to planet Earth. We've eliminated everything except one last remaining explanation. Aliens came here 3.8 billion years ago and salted the Earth with life. And by the way, it wasn't the first time that was suggested at a scientific meeting. Back in the 1980s, you've got Francis Crick and Leslie Orgel actually writing a book making that serious proposal, based on the fact they've eliminated all other naturalistic explanations. Now, there were 2 of us at that research conference that were Christians, and Fuzz and I were at that conference. And I kind of nudged him, and by the way, Bill Schaff was right in front of us, one of the organizers of the conference. He heard what we were saying, you know what, I think he's on the right track. It is someone from outer space that's come and put life here on planet Earth, but it's not an alien from this planetary system. It's a being from beyond space and time. And actually, I think one of our books out there is Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, where we explain it can't be physical aliens like us. Why? It takes 13.8 billion years for aliens as intelligent as us even to be physically possible. You can't get intelligent beings that early in the history of the universe. And as you can see in the book, it's not possible to space-time travel from a site that's very distant from us to reach here, planet Earth. A machine might make it here, but you're not going to have beings traveling here. So, by the way, I've got several articles on our reasons.org website where I guarantee I'm going to ruin your enjoyment for Star Wars and Star Trek. Okay.
Dr. Ross, I think that's all we have time for tonight.
Can I mention just one thing, though?
Sure.
I want all of you to be comfortable and confident with defending Genesis 1. Now, we've done it Reasons to Believe as we produce a small group DVD series called Navigating Genesis. It's basically 20-minute DVDs that you can show over an 8-week period, and you engage people in discussion, and basically what it does is equip everybody to be confident in using this as a tool to bring people to faith in Jesus Christ. You don't have to teach it. All you got to do is turn on the DVD player. So that's available. Thank you.
And that's actually available in the cafe.
Right.
Dr. Ross has agreed to hang around with us. If you'd like to join us for specialty coffees and conversation in the cafe through these doors. Most of the books that Dr. Ross mentioned during the presentation, especially Navigating Genesis, will be available for sale there. Again, Dr. Ross, thank you very much for coming.
Very welcome. Thank you.